For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kristen Taddy, and I manage Montgomery Planning's forest conservation programs. So you might have heard of Reforest Montgomery or the Forest Mitigation Bank program, which many of you will be familiar with. And I'm excited to now also be leading this No Net Loss of Forest initiative on behalf of the Planning Department. So as many of you know, when it comes to amending the forest conservation law, there are many steps in this process, and there will be several opportunities for input, which are shown highlighted here. So it's important to note that the ideas we're presenting today have not gone through internal reviews yet. Our goal with the working groups, which is step number 1, that's where we are now, our goal is to get your input at the very beginning of this process before we even begin to draft an amendment. So let's take a look at where Montgomery County is when it comes to forest conservation. This information that I'm sharing here comes from our annual reporting data. And so since 1993 or fiscal year 1994, projects subject to the Montgomery County Forest Conservation Law have cleared 4,440 acres of forest, planted over 2,800 acres of forest and protected those planted forests, protected over 12,800 acres of pre-existing forest, which means that in total, through the law, those projects planted and protected a total of 15,705 acres of forest in the county. And Montgomery County, for reference and to understand the scale of that, Montgomery County has 95,000 acres of forest, which is about 29% of the county. And 25,600 acres of that are located on protected parkland. That's separate from the acreage that we're looking at above. So if you combine protected forest on parkland with protected forest that has been planted or protected through the forest conservation law, we're looking at least 43% of Montgomery County's forests that are protected by long-term easement or parkland. So many of you will be very familiar with how the requirements of the forest conservation law work, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same page going into these discussions. So first of all, when we reference the forest conservation threshold for a project, we're referring to a percentage of the net tract area, which is defined by the law and differs depending on the land use category for the project. So if less than this area of forest is cleared, there's a lower required reforestation ratio. And if more of this area of forest is cleared, then there's a higher required reforestation ratio. Importantly, what we mean when we say clearing above the threshold is that the project would be clearing less forest. Below the threshold indicates clearing more forest. So that is a little confusing, even to those of us who look at this all the time. And I'll show an example in a moment of a diagram that explains that in a little bit more detail. The afforestation threshold, on the other hand, is also a percentage of the net tract area, also differing depending on land use category. And if there's no forest or less than this area of forest on the site, the project must meet that afforestation requirement to create forest. So this is a big way that the forest conservation law creates new forest in the county. So let's take a look at this example. So we have a example net tract area of 100 acres with 70 acres in forest cover. The land use category for the project is medium density residential, which means per the law, the conservation threshold is 25% or 25 acres, 25% of the net tract area, so 25 acres. That means that there's 45 acres in the area above that 25 acre threshold. So if the project proposes to clear 40 acres, which is above that threshold or less than the area above the threshold, then they would need to reforest at the lower ratio. If the project is looking to clear below the threshold, 55 acres, for example, they would be clearing more, and then they would need to meet the higher reforestation ratio as well as the lower ratio. So that should help kind of ground us as we start to talk through some of these real projects later on. So let's look at Montgomery County's forest conservation law today and compare that to some recent no net loss amendments in other counties nearby. So as you've just seen, Montgomery County's forest conservation law currently has reforestation ratios of 1/4 acre of planting required for every 1 acre of forest removed if a project is clearing above the threshold or less, and 2 acres of planting required for every 1 acre removed if a project is clearing below the threshold or more. So let's compare that with 3 other Maryland counties who recently introduced no net loss amendments. This is Howard County, and they increased their reforestation ratios and incentivized reforestation within the same watershed by requiring less reforestation if the reforestation was occurring in the same watershed as the project. So we're going to look at a similar idea for Montgomery County in a few minutes, actually. Anne Arundel County made a small change, increasing the reforestation ratio for clearing above the threshold from 1/4 to 1 to 1/2 to 1. And Frederick County introduced something slightly different, either a 1-to-1 replacement or the original reforestation ratios, whichever method results in greater replanting. So it's important to note here that depending on the details of the project and depending on each unique scenario, sometimes the original reforestation ratios result in a greater replanting or greater requirement than 1-to-1. And that's why Frederick introduced this approach. So now we'll do the same thing for comparing thresholds and afforestation. Really, we're going to focus on thresholds here because that is what the other counties, well, one other county actually made some changes to. So currently, Montgomery County has thresholds of 50% in the agricultural land use category, 25% for medium density residential, 20% for institutional, mixed use and planned unit development areas, and 15% in commercial and industrial areas. Afforestation requirements are 20% in the lower density land use categories and 15% in the higher density land use categories. So Howard County and Frederick County did not change their thresholds. For the most part, these counties' thresholds match Montgomery County's, except that Frederick County has a lower threshold than Howard or Montgomery County for projects in the mixed use category. And then Anne Arundel County did increase thresholds. Let me move this so you all can see. Anne Arundel County did increase thresholds in certain land use categories depending on the location and the tract area. Again, we're going to look at a very similar idea for Montgomery County in a few minutes. And then when it comes to afforestation thresholds, all counties still have the same afforestation thresholds, 20% in the low density land use categories and 15% in the higher density land use categories. So over the next 3 slides, we're going to review our ideas for strengthening the forest conservation law. So first, we're considering increasing replanting ratios to incentivize mitigation within the same watershed as the project. We've analyzed 15 real projects, and we're going to go through each of them. And these are the ratios we felt resulted in reasonable increases to the requirements that would also result in no net loss across projects. So reforestation would be 1/2 to 1 if clearing was above the threshold within the same watershed, with reforestation occurring within the same watershed. 1 to 1 if clearing was above the threshold and reforestation occurred outside the same watershed. And this would remain at 2 to 1 if clearing was below the threshold, regardless of whether that reforestation occurred within or outside the same watershed. Our ideas for increasing the forest conservation thresholds most closely match Anne Arundel County's approach, and they're focused on increasing thresholds in lower density land use categories where there's more forest and more space for replanting. And in addition, we're the only county looking at increasing afforestation requirements in some of the higher density land use categories where there tends to be less forest and less space for on-site planting, except potentially for institutional properties where there may be more space. So we're looking at introducing a 5-acre cap for these new requirements except for institutional properties, where again, there's more space to keep the increased requirements reasonable because these projects are removing no or little to no forest to begin with. So in addition to an amendment, we're considering some additions to our forest conservation programs to support the amendment and encourage applicants to go above and beyond forest conservation law requirements. So we were looking at potentially introducing a new program or system that would connect property owners interested in free protected reforestation on their properties to applicants seeking offsite planting locations. And this would support some of the amendments that some of the amendment ideas that I just presented. In addition, we may introduce a program, or we could introduce a program for yearly nominations for projects with the best outcomes for forests in Montgomery County. For example, projects that have a significant net gain or go above and beyond those requirements. And we have a substantial number of those projects occurring already, so it would be great to give them some recognition. And then just a final note that any new or expanded programs really would require additional staff. So we would need that to kind of come along with some of these amendments and program additions as well. Okay, so we're going to share our analysis of 15 actual projects with forest conservation law requirements, showing their required reforestation and or afforestation with the forest conservation law as is, and then showing how that requirement would change with the ideas for a no net loss amendment that we just presented. So we're going to go from down county to mid county to up county, and we've specifically selected projects with a range of land use categories and requirements and levels of forest clearing so that you can see how an amendment would play out in these different scenarios across the country. Excuse me, across the county. Give me one moment. So some of you may be familiar with these projects, and in some cases, complex projects have multiple forest conservation requirements for different phases, so they have multiple worksheets. For simplicity, we've selected just one worksheet as an example for some of those projects, so if the requirement is not quite the same as what you remember, that's probably why. So first is 2710 Washington Avenue, which is an administrative subdivision plan to subdivide one existing lot into two, retaining two existing single-family homes on each lot. With the no net loss ideas, reforestation would increase to 0.19 acres if it were to occur within the same watershed, and 0.34 acres if it were to occur outside the same watershed. So this is a result of increasing reforestation ratios from 1/4 to 1 to 1/2 to 1 or 1 to 1 for clearing above the threshold, and then no change in the 2 to 1 reforestation requirement for clearing below the threshold. Carteret Springs was an administrative subdivision plan in Bethesda that proposed to demolish the existing home and subdivide one lot into two for a new single-family dwelling unit on each lot. So there was no on-site forest in this case, and the afforestation requirements were addressed on site. So with the no net loss ideas, the afforestation requirement would increase to 1/4 acre as a result of increasing the afforestation requirement from 15% to 20% in high density residential land use categories for sites that are less than 5 acres. The Bethesda Center site plan proposed redevelopment of an urban site within the Bethesda Central Business District. There was no forest on site. In this case, with the no net loss ideas, the afforestation requirement would increase to 0.45 acres as a result, again, of increasing the afforestation requirement to 20%. The Bannockburn Swim Club was a special exception for renovation of an existing pool. And this is our first example where there would be no change in the requirement due to the credit for retention above the threshold. So this is a great example of why we have so many acres of protected pre-existing forest in Montgomery County. And so this is a great incentive for that and is working. And so this is something that we would not want to change, but it is an example of one of those projects that would have no change. So now moving to Mid-County, the Wilgus project proposed development of 107 townhomes, 34 2-over-2 units, and eventually a multifamily building near the White Flint Metro Station. So there's 11.3 acres of forest on site, and all of it was cleared. And with the no net loss ideas, the requirement would increase to 10.21 acres within the watershed, or 14.34 acres outside the watershed, as a result of increasing the reforestation ratios from 1/4 to 1 to 1/2 to 1 and 1 to 1, and then no change in the 2 to 1 requirement for clearing below the threshold. Bloom MV was a proposal to redevelop the 147-acre Montgomery Village golf course to build over or just under 500 dwelling units. And there was 0.43 acres of forest, which was all retained. And this is another example of where there would be no change to the afforestation requirement as a result of there being no change to the afforestation requirement for sites over 5 acres in mixed use land use categories. So South Lake Elementary School was a project proposing to demolish all but a small portion of the existing school and rebuild approximately 106,000 square foot elementary school on 10.2 acres in Montgomery Village. And again, there would be no change here due to there being no change in the 2 to 1 reforestation ratio for clearing below the threshold, and no change in the afforestation requirement for high density residential sites greater than 5 acres. This project, Jefferson at Inigos Crossing, was for a new condominium building in Rockville on a site with no forest in the institutional land use category. So in this case, there would be an increased afforestation requirement as a result of increasing afforestation requirements to 20% in all IDA sites, regardless of size. So moving to Up County now, the Matini Hill Road project proposed subdivision of the site into 46 lots, mainly for one family attached units, and a parcel for open space. And so all forest on the site, 1.81 acres, was cleared, resulting in a 2.53 acre reforestation requirement. So with the no net loss ideas, this requirement would increase to 2.68 acres within the same watershed and 3 acres outside the watershed, as a result of increasing the reforestation ratios to 1/2 to 1 and 1 to 1 for clearing above the threshold, and no change in 2 to 1 reforestation requirement for clearing below the threshold. The Mount Prospect Drive project in Potomac proposed to subdivide a property into 3 lots for the construction of 3 new single-family detached homes. And with no net loss, the requirement would increase to 0.64 acres and 1.27 acres outside the same watershed, or the exact amount cleared, as a result of, again, increasing the reforestation ratios for clearing above the threshold to 1/2 to 1 and 1 to 1. So the next project required a sediment control permit for the purposes of establishing a veterinary hospital on an existing recorded lot. And as is, the project was not required to meet a requirement due to on-site retention. However, with the no net loss amendment ideas we talked about, there would be reforestation requirements in this case as a result of increasing reforestation ratios to 1/2 to 1 and 1 to 1 for clearing above the threshold, and increasing the threshold itself from 50% to 55% in the agricultural land use category. So the next 2 projects are very similar: 2 school redevelopment projects in institutional land use categories with no forest, and afforestation requirements that would increase from 15 to 20% regardless of the net tract area. So this project would have a slightly higher afforestation requirement of 2.07 acres, And this project, Seneca Valley High School, would have a slightly more significant requirement because of its larger tract area of 3.48 acres. Next, this proposal for eight one-family detached houses over 27 acres with a small amount of forest impact required both reforestation and afforestation. And with the no net loss amendment ideas we discussed, there would be no change in this case as a result of there being no change to the 2-to-1 reforestation requirement for clearing below the threshold and no change in afforestation requirements in medium density residential zones. And then in this case, since it's medium density residential, there would be an increase to the conservation threshold to 35%, up from 25%, but that doesn't make a difference for this particular project since they are clearing so little. And finally, another no change project is the Lufsey property. A special exception was required for the continued use of the property for an outdoor storage facility and construction of 4,000 square foot trailer garage. So this is a result of there being no change to the afforestation requirements in the agricultural land use category. So I wanted to take a summarized look at all 15 projects that we just analyzed as a sort of snapshot of the types of forest conservation plans we see across the county. So with the forest conservation law as is, these 15 projects we just looked at, removed 15.52 acres of forest, required 11.42 acres of reforestation, requiring 38.8 acres of afforestation with total forest mitigation requirements of just over 50 acres. Now, as we look at what would change here with these no net loss ideas, I really want to focus on the first two bullet points here. So with the no net loss ideas, the total reforestation that would be required within the same watershed would be 14 acres, while if those projects opted to meet their requirements outside the same watershed, those requirements would be closer to 20 acres. So we would expect that between these two, the reforestation alone would average out to exceed the 15.52 acres of forest removed. And then in addition, of course, afforestation increases to about 45 acres, and the total amount of mitigation increases as well because of that.